The Alberta government just released a so-called sunshine list of all public employees earning more than $100,000, and the City of Calgary is considering a similar disclosure. Proponents of transparency and taxpayer rights are applauding the lists, but critics warn such disclosures often lead to employee rivalry and bigger salaries in the long run. Are sunshine lists important information for the public or an intrusion on personal privacy? And do they lead to greater transparency or greater public salaries? And joining us this evening in Calgary is Derek Fildebrandt, Director of the Alberta portion of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. And via Skype from Ontario is Richard Leblanc, Associate Professor, Law, Corporate Governance and Ethics at York University. Thank you for your time, both of you, tonight.
Hi, Sean.
Pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Other provinces, such as Ontario, where you are, sunshine lists, they're old hat, they've been around for quite some time, and you've had a chance to study how they work. So should Albertans expect any other surprises after this salary release here in Alberta?
Well, I don't see Alberta as being different from any other jurisdiction that has introduced sunshine or transparency lists. The evidence, I think, Derek, I agree with a lot of what Derek said. In order for cost containment to occur and accountability, compensation setters have to have guidance and to sort of deter this rivalry that happens. What has happened is people are competitive, so people will look at the names and they will use that as leverage in pay negotiations to exert upwards discretion on their pay. And people who study these things have found that it results in a 17% increase year over year that is ratcheting up by the use of peer groups. Because what will happen in Alberta is, as in other jurisdictions that have done this, is consultants and pay advisors will begin to take these numbers and sell them back to executives and to pay setters in the form of peer benchmarking. And that really has a ratcheting up effect. So for cost containment, which is what Derek mentioned, the evidence has been in the opposite direction. In fact, that salaries have gone up, compensation has gone up and up and up, and we have trouble containing it because of these structural things that are embedded in simply flicking on a switch. So I would caution that simply flicking the switch won't necessarily have the law have what you intended. So regulators now, governments, are beginning to toy with the concept of looking at bans or of employees and shielding certain names to prevent this rivalry. There's a court challenge for privacy concerns, for example, and I think it's unique in Canada, and I think it has an excellent chance of succeeding because Crown prosecutors and others to have their salary disclosed. We are not in 1996 anymore like when we started in Ontario. There's strong concerns about organized crime, about the identity theft, the ability to use this information for untoward purposes. So I think we have a collision of rights here that lawyers will argue, and I think governments have to exercise greater care. If Derek is absolutely right, transparency is intended, accountability is intended, cost containment is intended, but to achieve what Derek is desiring, there needs to be greater care in crafting how compensation is awarded. There are downsides to simply flicking the switch on.
Many people think there's really good spin-off benefit for people in the private sector, and even you, Richard, have said that you use the list yourself to bump up the pay for yourself for your salary.
Yes, I have, and I'm, just a human being. I'm looking at what the list contains, and I would use it, and I have used it, and it resulted in a benefit, and I think I used myself as an example. I'd be interested in seeing the data set that Derek refers to. I think he is correct that Ontario does not include total compensation. Jurisdictions that have done this have included total compensation, but even if you do include total compensation, it doesn't eliminate that ratcheting effect. And then what happens when the public sector begins to disclose their salaries is pay advisors compare public sector to private sector. comparables. And there's benefits of being a public sector employee, such as seniority, labor rights that are not necessarily reflected in one compensation number. So there's even greater upward pressure. And we've had scandals in Ontario, for example, in e-health, in OLG, in Orange, in most recently Ontario Power Generation, that have involved governance and have involved compensation, because there's so much upward pressure to compare public employees among themselves and also to the private sector by use of these peer benchmarks and peer groups. I think greater guidance needs to be offered at the pay setting stage. So I don't see Alberta. It will be interesting to see, but I don't know of a jurisdiction that has introduced sunshine laws where compensation has actually gone down. The opposite has occurred, and there's a disconnect to performance, which is the troubling thing. So I think for Alberta to be truly world class, there needs to be care exercised in how compensation is awarded. Governments now are looking at what's known as risk-adjusted compensation and performance over time. So the greater we can focus on contribution to the organization and not what your peers are earning, the better. That's where the disconnect comes.
I think that for at least some senior officials, it's going to be difficult to tell more in the middle management area, but at least for senior officials, I would not be surprised if this is going to exert downward pressure on this. I mean, when politicians have to pay a political price for paying off their chief of staff with, say, huge severance packages that happened to her last chief of staff, you're not going to attach a political price to pay for that, whereas before that was hidden information.
Derek, I agree with you. I just haven't seen it. I haven't seen the shame, the aha, the downward discretion, because the arguments, as I'm sure you would appreciate, the arguments come out, you need to pay people what they're worth. You need to compete when we have crown corporations. We want to be a competitive economy. You need to compete for talent. I mean, these arguments are trotted out by executives and by pay setters. So we've had problems in Ontario that has gotten so out of control that, in fact, the Premier has said that she will introduce potential caps to be 2x, twice her salary. Which is equally outrageous. The notion of exerting a cap. So I think just opening the floodgates in pure transparency won't necessarily result in the downward pressure. There's such a competitive rivalry, and there's arguments that are so well presented about the war for talent. We need to be competitive, that it's very tough as a counterpoint. And now, Derek, you're negotiating with someone that has full data. They come in, they've got full data from the pay consultants, the data from their peers, and they're hard charging, and they're high talent, and you don't want to lose it. So it's very difficult for pay setters, for compensation committees, to counter that sort of that information, that strength, that bargaining strength.
Well, we have to cut it here, I'm afraid. Sorry, Richard. That's definitely a lot of passion with the two of you. We have completely run out of time, and definitely it is having people talking here in Alberta and all across the country. Thank you for your insight, both of you, tonight.
Thanks, Shauna. Thanks, Derek.
My pleasure. Thanks for having us.
That is Derek Fildebrandt, Alberta Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and via Skype from Ontario, Richard Leblanc, Associate Professor, Law, Corporate Governance and Ethics at York University.